I'm Jana Wong Healy, and I've been a film industry professional for years, having worked in development, production, and distribution for a variety of film studios and companies. I currently teach business communication at the University of Southern California's Marshall School of Business. I'm here with Stephen Gundel, a professor of film and television studies at the University of Warwick in the UK, a film historian and an expert on Italian cinema. His latest book, Fame Amid the Ruins, Italian Film Stardom in the Age of Neorealism, is now published and available for purchase. Today, we're talking about weird and wacky movies. So a lot of different things can be defined as weird and wacky. So Stephen, why don't you tell us your definition of weird and wacky in relation to Dino's filmography?
Well, I think if we look at Dino's body of work, and there are a lot of films, we can see behind those films some sort of pattern. I mean, there's a great variety, but we can see a producer who's working off intuition, who's making recourse to literary adaptations, who's making star vehicles, who's making big spectacles, who's always trying to reach audiences with different forms of entertainment. There are some films that Dino made, however, which don't seem to fit in with this broad pattern for one reason or another, either because the content seems really offbeat or, even perverse, or because the plots are strange and implausible. There are a few projects which are plain risky. And in particular, this applies to the Italian films because Italians were very touchy about some issues in the national history relating to World War I and World War II in particular. And filmmakers generally avoided those topics. So there are a couple of films which tackle them head on, which Dino produced. That was unusual. I think there are also a few projects which we could describe as being almost kitsch, and also one or two which have a very strong erotic content, and that is something that's actually not a trend or feature of many of Dino's films. So I think we can look at a few which we can put on the margins in a way. Some of them were successful, some of them weren't. But all of them are sort of offbeat with relation to this dominant pattern.
So you mentioned that many of them were from his period of producing in Italy. So should we start there and then move on to the films in America?
Yeah, let's do that, because I think, some of these wacky early films come from the time when he was sort of learning his trade, mastering his trade as a producer. I think by the time he'd moved to the United States, he was an experienced producer who was trying to make, let's say, surefire entertainment. So there's less experimentation, I would say.
So one of his early films is The Fireman of Vigio. Am I pronouncing that totally?
That's right. Yes, it's 1949 actually. It came out 1950. This is from the time when Dino was still working with Luxfilm, one of the bigger Italian companies to emerge in the immediate post-war years, and it was at a time when Italian cinema was trying to find a way to win audiences. Now that might sound a bit of a strange thing, but we have to remember, first of all, that Hollywood films dominated the market in the immediate post-war period. Film production in Italy ground to a halt virtually. The studios, Hollywood studios, who'd withdrawn from the Italian market in 1939, came back determined to win back that dominant position they'd had in the market in the 1930s. The second thing to bear in mind is that the passion for film going was spreading far and wide at this time, and many areas of the poorer south of Italy were getting new cinemas built for the very first time. Some of them literally as annexes to churches. The Catholic Church built new churches and often built the cinema next door. So a lot of people's first encounter with cinema was through the parish cinema circuit. So producers like Dino had to sort of find a way of competing with Hollywood and appealing to this new southern audience, which often was outside the big cities. So one of the ways in which he tried to do that, and other producers tried to do it, was to take the stars of variety theatre, who were quite well known, who often were from particular places, Sicily or Naples or Rome, and traded on that specificity. And in this film, The Fireman of Viju, what he did was to sort of grab a load of these stars of the stage, dress them up as firemen, and create this rather silly plot whereby one of them runs away from their small town of Viju to the big city to become a chorus girl. And so the firemen, chase after her, go to, the theatre, try to persuade the girl to come back, and in the meantime end up sort of performing on stage. So you get a lot of sort of snippets and sketches and songs from the repertoire of Italian popular theatre, which are sort of put together, shoehorned into this very flimsy plot. To create an entertainment which is far more theatrical, it should be said, than cinematic. So, it was a drawing board exercise which, was pretty successful, it should be said. And I suppose, we can sort of, people in Italy remember this film, both because of its strangeness, because of the stars, and because in a way it showed how cinema in the sort of early post-war years was often heavily shaped by theatre and other forms of popular entertainment.
Last time we were talking about Dino and the star system, and we were talking about his wife, Silvana Mangano, and how he worked really hard to get properties for her to star in. Would you consider his 1951 movie Anna to be one of these weird and wacky movies?
Well, Anna is a film that did incredibly well at the box office. It was one of those films that really turned Silvana Mangano into a big star. She'd done Bitter Rice, of course, and made her name through that film. And Anna was a film which was really about a showgirl who becomes a nun. Right, so it's about, this sort of a plot, appealed, particularly in Italy, I would say, as a Catholic country, the idea that the sinner can be reformed, and so on. It was sort of a melodramatic template which worked, and in fact there was another film. There was a series of films made by a film production company called DINO'S, which was doing very well, making popular melodramas. And Dino looked to this and thought, well, look, maybe we can make something similar and put Silvana Mangano in it. So Anna, which is the name of the protagonist that she plays, is this girl who's a dancer, an entertainer, and she's sort of fought over by two men who then literally fight each other, and one of them is killed. And she, out of feelings of guilt, becomes a nun and works in a hospital and does good deeds and so on, until the surviving suitor turns up again and rekindles her feelings, and she has to decide, am I going to stay as a nun and a nurse, or am I going to sort of resume my old life with the man who I love? And of course she chooses to stay in the hospital, as a nun, and so on. So it's a mishmash which the director only directed because he was told to, having lost money on the previous film, which he hated and always spoke badly of, Alberto Lattuada, whose previous film made with Fellini called Variety Lights had been a big flop. He made this film, spoke badly about it, but it was a huge box office hit, and it added that other dimension to Silvana. She had this erotic dimension, which came from Bitter Ice, where she'd also danced. And this added a more sort of aloof, mysterious and spiritual aspect, let's say, to her star persona.
Speaking of dancing, he produced a movie called Mambo, which had to do with the Mambo dance craze that was going across the United States and Europe.
Well, yeah, that's right. And this is another Silvana Mangano film, and another one in which she again dances. You know, this was becoming her hallmark almost. You know, people went to the cinema to see a film with Silvana Mangano and expected to see her dancing. She later said they only wanted to see my legs, but you know, she was a good dancer, and I think that was something that you know, was exploited in these films. I mean, Mambo is another film though where she is fought over by two men. And for the third time, you know, Bitter Ice, Anna and Mambo, one of them, the evil one, let's say, is played by the same actor, Vittorio Gassman, who was a stage actor, but with a certain presence, who was playing, you know, bad guys pretty consistently at this time. But the film is interesting. I mean, we can say it's wacky because it's one of the first films where Dino was really trying to put together different international elements. And they seem really to be sort of drawn from here and there without any particular rhyme and reason. The project was developed by Robert Rossen, an American director who, along with several others, had to leave the United States in the McCarthy era. No work available to him, and had found refuge in Europe, and in particular Italy. He'd been shopping this sort of project around, again, about a dancer. The film is largely set in Venice, principally because it was thought images of Venice would help sell the film internationally. It features a mixed Italian and international cast, and among the people in the film is the choreographer Catherine Dunham, who actually sort of coaches Silvana's character in a number of scenes and so on. Now, this is a film that, you know, didn't do quite as well, and critics saw it as being a mishmash of different themes, some, you know, taken from previous Silvana films, some you know, clearly aiming at a commercial market, others you know, there are influences of film noir in there. You know, it was a film that, in a way, was sort of trying to succeed by putting too much in the pot.
One of the parameters you say for weird and wacky is erotic content. So he made a movie with Carlo Ponti called Girls Marked Danger. That seems like it would be fairly erotic if you just by the...
Yeah. Well, you know, the title, this was the American or English-speaking title, Girls Marked Danger, you know, which already sort of resonates with a pulp novel feel. The Italian title was La Tratta delle Bianche, which I suppose translated literally would mean the white female slave trade. So the idea is that you have a situation whereby women are being sort of kidnapped by an organized crime gang, and then sort of sent off into a life of prostitution. So the gang is a gang of pimps and so on. Now, this sort of rather sort of sleazy theme, you know, we can find in a number of post-war Italian films, and I suppose it's because, you know, prostitution was a very widespread phenomenon in Italy during the years of foreign occupation, first German and then the Allied occupation. It was also legally organized. Brothels were licensed by the state. This was the old Napoleonic system. It was abolished in France in the post-war years, but in Italy survived until 1958, which seems, you know, really, really strange, you know, that you had state licensed brothels that prostitution wasn't illegal, but was been virtually state regulated in certain ways. So the idea that there was this sort of subworld with criminal aspects was quite a common one, and this was a film that reflected that sort of environment. And it was a film that, you know, featured a number of prominent emerging actresses of the time. I think both Carlo Ponti and Dino De Laurentiis, who worked closely together, both with the Lux Company, which they'd worked for, then separately before in the mid-50s each went his own way. And they'd sort of made promises and issued contracts to a lot of the women who had emerged from the world of beauty contests in the post-war years, in this case including Silvana Pampanini. Not Silvana Manco, Silvana Pampanini, who was a sort of popular showgirl who'd been the runner-up to Miss Italy in 1946. There was Eleonora Rossi Drago and several others, you know, featured in this film. So there are noir elements, but it's clearly sort of catering to, let's say, a certain sort of perverse taste. And you know, the film posters are very lurid. You know, as you can imagine. So it's not really, you know, I think, you know, Dino went along with this, was involved with it. It was more of a Ponti film. Had a respectable director, Luigi Comencini, but it's sort of a bit off beam as far as Dino's, you know, main output is concerned.
Before we move on to his American films, are there any films like his history films of Dino's that can be considered weird or wacky? It seems like that wouldn't be, but there probably are. He's produced so many films.
Well, I think we have to mention a couple because a lot of historical films were made in Italy through the 60s and the 70s. Virtually none in the 1950s. And the reason for that is because Italy was emerging from the fascist dictatorship, of course. And there was a lot of sensitivity about revisiting the historical past. It was felt to be too controversial. And there was a danger that any revisitations of the fascist past or some of the darker episodes of World War I might in some way cast the country's ruling elite in a bad light. And at the time of the Cold War, when Italy had a very large communist party, this was felt to be dangerous and best avoided. Now, there were two films. The first one made in 1959, which is called The Great War. And the second film just made a couple of years later, which is the Verona trial, which actually tackled, you know, head on very difficult topics in the national history, and did so with a certain unusual viewpoint. So the Great War, I mean, Italy, of course, had been on the winning side in World War I. So there was nothing sort of shameful there, although before being on the winning side, Italy had undergone a terrible, terrible defeat, which had almost led to the invasion of the country. The Battle of Caporetto, which, you know, is sort of fixed in the Italian mind, even to this day, as a moment of national defeat and humiliation. This was, you know, absolutely a taboo topic. Dino produced a film which was focused around this event, and which featured two ordinary soldiers, one from Milan and one from Rome, played by, well, the one from Milan was played by Vittorio Gassman, who we've mentioned before, and the one from Rome was played by a very popular comedian of the time, who Dino had under contract, Alberto Sordi. And they play, you know, it's a tragicomedy. They play this mismatched couple of cowards, really. They're not brave Italian soldiers. You know, they are ready to betray their country. They're doing everything to get out of fighting in the war. And only at the very end do they redeem themselves by refusing to reveal any information when they're captured by the Austrians, and they end up being executed. So if you like, there's a good end. But they show the ordinary Italian soldier as being primarily self-interested, not attached in any way to patriotic ideals, and therefore, you get this very sort of unrhetorical picture of the Italians in wartime, and it was hugely controversial as a film. It had to be filmed largely outside of Italy. When it was released, there were lots and lots of protests. Today, it's recognised, and was recognised at the time, it should be said. I mean, it was nominated for the Oscar for Best Foreign Language Film as a great Italian-style comedy. But nonetheless, very offensive as far as the military elite was concerned, and people who were still around, of course, at that time in large numbers, who'd fought in World War One. So that's one. The other one, the Verona trial, is really about the trial of the senior fascists who'd voted Mussolini out of power in 1943. Then Mussolini was rescued and restored to power by Hitler. But nonetheless, there were a group of fascists, including Mussolini's own son-in-law, Galeazzo Ciano, who had voted against him, voted him out of power, who were regarded as traitors. They were sent for trial in 1944 and were executed. So this, again, was a very touchy moment in national history and had not been dealt with on film before. It was the left-wing director, Carlo Lizzani, who directed the film, and he tackled it unusually by looking at it from the woman's point of view. So Mussolini's wife, Mussolini's daughter, who was married to Galeazzo Ciano, and one or two other sort of figures. Mussolini himself is makes a very brief appearance, played by an actor in the film, but he's not the focus. So it brought a different angle to events, but was again, very, very controversial, because it was the first film to touch this well-known episode in national history. So I think these two films together showed Dino's courage. They were both successful. And it showed that sometimes, risks paid off. That, producers in Italy always had to get on well with governments. They couldn't at this time really step too far out of line. And here Dino did, and paid off. So, going off beam in this instance really helped define him as a producer willing to plot a course of his own.
You mentioned the dark comedy of The Great War, but he also did another dark comedy called Il Boom. Would you consider that to be also a weird and wacky film in Dino's career?
The boom, of course, is the great period of rapid economic growth that happened in Italy between the 1950s and 60s. When the country went from being sort of poor and mostly agricultural to being an industrial power. The Boom is a dark comedy about a businessman, a construction entrepreneur, who is riding the crest of the wave of the boom, the economic boom, but gets into debt, gets into trouble, and is on the verge of bankruptcy. When he is given a chance to suddenly get his hands on a lot of money. But the chance involves him donating an eye. There's a very wealthy man who has lost the sight in one eye, who is looking for a donor to give him a new eye. So the prospect is given to him. Okay, your debts can be paid off, but you've got to donate an eye. So it's really, the eye is almost a symbol of the soul, right? Is Italy going to give up its soul, or is this man going to give up his soul in pursuit of wealth and prosperity? And it's played by Alberto Sordi, this character, this great Italian sort of comedian of the time, a great sort of satirist of mores and customs. And it's played along. He accepts, gets the money, and then tries to get out of the donation, of course. He runs off. But he's brought back, and, the film ends with him having to, go to the hospital to honour his part of the bargain. He normally played dishonorable types. So the idea of him, running away just as he played the coward in the Great War. Now, the curious thing about this film is it's in a way quite typical of a certain strand of Italian-style comedy of that period, which is sort of reflecting on the changing values of this period of economic change. But it's directed by Vittorio De Sica, who had made his name with Bicycle Thieves, Umberto D, some great near-realist classics of the immediate post-war period. And this is an unusual film for him. He went on to direct a lot of Sophie Loren films and returned to acting, which he'd done, even before Bicycle Thieves in the 30s and so on. But this is a quite sort of different sort of film. He's not normally associated with these Italian-style comedies, and so for that reason, as well as the really sort of strange and slightly unsettling plot, I think we can define it as a rather wacky project.
Dino moves from Italy to America and starts producing films here, and he produces high-intensity, really well-made dramas like Serpico and 3 Days of the Condor, and then there's Firestarter in his filmography. How did that come about?
Well, I think we can identify certainly a few American films which, some may disagree, some may not regard these as sort of weird or wacky in any way at all. If we look at Firestarter, which was produced for the Dino De Laurentiis company by Martha Schumacher, who would later become his wife. This is a film about a young girl who has a sort of a special mental power that starts fires. She's if you like, a sort of psychological pyromaniac almost. Now, if you look at it like that, you think, this is nonsense. There is no such thing, pyrokinesis. It doesn't exist. So where's this coming from? When, however, we know that this is a Stephen King novel, it takes on a different complexion. This is a film, Firestarter, from 1984. By that time, Stephen King had his novels had inspired Carrie in 1976, The Shining in 1980, The Dead Zone and Christine in 1983. So in a way, Stephen King is a sort of guarantee, best-selling author of proven adaptability in terms of plots and situations to cinema. So I think when we look at it like that, we can see that this is a pretty solid project, and in fact, it was successful. It made money. But as often with the sort of supernatural thrillers that Stephen King writes, the plot in itself, the situation, is totally implausible. To be sure, if we remove the implausible from the world of the movies, we might lose half of film history. But nonetheless, you have to think these projects, when they're on paper, what do they look like? What's the pitch for a film like this? Well, you've got to put Stephen King in there to make it somehow a runner.
Are there any other films from his American producing career that you would classify as weird and wacky?
Well, I think we can, Dino's American films are the best known ones are the big spectacles, those like Serpico, which you mentioned, which helped sort of make his name after he moved to the United States. But I certainly think we can pick out two. One is Blue Velvet, David Lynch's Blue Velvet. Now, this is of course a classic film by now, perhaps a masterpiece of sorts. But David Lynch made his name with very offbeat films, Eraserhead, and The Elephant Man. Then, of course, he made Dune, this science fiction adaptation of Frank Herbert novel, which was a huge budget film, which flopped. So, he wasn't exactly at the best point in his career when he made Blue Velvet. which is a film that's, aesthetically beautiful, but has a sort of, a strange plot. It, sort of begins with an ear being found on a lawn, and then this massive conspiracy is revealed. And I think, really Dino took a punt on this film. I mean, the film is undoubtedly wacky and strange in its content and its aesthetics, its whole sort of look and feel, and that's part of its charm and appeal. But I think Dino took a gamble on this film, and a gamble on David Lynch. Remember, he had this record of trusting directors who he regarded as artists. He let them alone to a large degree, sometimes completely. Whereas those who he regarded as sort of, workmanlike directors, they were the ones who were controlled and told what to do, and so on. So David Lynch was a director who had a lot of respect for, and he certainly speaks very well of his experience of working with Dino. So that's one. I mean, the other one, I would say, is the Madonna vehicle, Body of Evidence. This is from 1992-93, and the film was a terrible flop. It's one of the few very strongly erotic films that Dino was involved with. Madonna, of course, huge star who had acting ambitions which went perhaps beyond her capabilities. Huge star in the music field, but maybe we never really quite made it successfully as she would have liked, as a sort of screen star. But Body of Evidence is an erotic thriller, and she's playing a femme fatale. And the film contains quite a few strong scenes. In keeping with screen femme fatale, she's killed off at the end. In terms of the ratings, there was a controversy. Cuts had to be made to get it the R rating. It's a film I think that is largely forgotten, but in terms of the broad output of Dino, I would say it's one of just a handful of films which have this sort of strong erotic aspect to them.
Well, an interesting aspect of Dino's producing career. So, thank you for that, and we will see you next time.
Thanks very much, Jana. I look forward to it.